Everything that we do, whether we're in an educational session, right, where I have my students collaborate with each other on projects, or we're in a corporation collaborating, or a nonprofit where collaboration with other nonprofits is very important. So I think that's really kind of interesting. I think it's great overcoming a challenge to find out what we want to accomplish. Gamification, we often talk about points, badges, and leaderboards, elements of rewards. And, if we look here, rewards are down compared to challenge and interactivity and story and goals. And it's interesting. I like different games at different times. So like if I'm tired or at the end of the day, I love Candy Crush because it's like almost non-thinking, just put stuff in order. But if I'm like fresh and want a game, I'll do Assassin's Creed and I'll do it in story mode, and I'll take my gentleman all through the town or whatever. It's accomplishing the goals and being immersed in that world and that story and that experience. So there's lots of different things to like, and lots of different very, very interesting agency and choice. I think is a good one as well. But yeah, I thought that collaboration was, if you think of games like Catan, which is sometimes we call it co-opetition, right? Where you're cooperating up to a certain point, and then all of a sudden you're fighting with somebody else to win the best road or something like that. Or if you look at another game, which is Pandemic, which got a lot of press the past few years for various reasons. That's where you're collaborating against the diseases in that game. So I think that's kind of an interesting element as well. But that's the one thing that makes games so interesting, is because different people like different things from games. So for example, my wife is really good at word games. Like she loves Wordle, she loves Boggle, Scrabble. I'm so bad at word. I do not like word games at all. But games like Connection, Scattergories, where you're kind of matching things, I like those kind of games. She doesn't like those kind of games. So one of the things that we fall into a trap as teachers or professors or designers of instruction is we create a game that we like. And we don't think about, well, is this game appropriate for the audience? Is this game appropriate for the people that we're trying to reach? So there's lots of different things to consider as we look at how we find games captivating.
Absolutely. And it's just sometimes you're right. We tend to just go by our preferences in the way we design learning experiences. And it's nice to see like a whole array of things that make game a game, but this is just the start. I think today we're going to really get into what it means to design a game and what it means to gamify learning experiences with none other than Karl Kapp. And we are so excited to have you here with us today, Karl, and also excited to have so many people joining us from all corners of the world. Just before we dive into this conversation with Dr. Kapp, I want to tell you a little bit about what the format of this session today. So what are we going to do in the next 55 minutes so that you can participate effectively? Maybe we go to the slide quickly. And I'll just start off by telling you it'll begin with a conversation. And as I'm asking questions to Karl, if there's any thought or a question popping up in your mind, please do feel free to write on chat. After about 30 minutes, we'll move to participants' questions. So we'll start taking questions from you and then ask Karl to respond to them. After that, we'll move from the expert insight to what I call peer inspiration, because that's where we really get motivation to apply these learnings that we have through these webinars. So we'll invite you to connect with learning professionals who are excited about the same topic. This is an optional bit. It happens after 1 hour. So if you are interested in meeting people who are attending the webinar today, do stay back for another 15 to 30 minutes to just get to know each other. The exchange doesn't stop there. Next Wednesday, we'll organize a meetup where we read a few chapters from Dr. Kapp's book and then discuss how they apply to our practice. You can also sign up for that in our events page that we'll post shortly on the chat. but also I'll take a few seconds to tell you about the community that's really organizing this webinar. On the next slide. So we are the Learning Designers community. It's a volunteer-led global network of learning designers from development, education, and corporate sectors dedicated to advancing impactful learning worldwide. We invite you to join this community to learn about evidence-based learning design, share knowledge and resources with peer practitioners, and also build authentic connections with fellow practitioners from across the globe. And you can join the community by following us on our LinkedIn page and also subscribing to our events page on Luma. The links are on the chat now. Okay, with that, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Karl Kapp. He doesn't really need an introduction, but for those of you who don't know him yet, he is one of the most renowned thought leaders in games and game thinking. His work is dedicated to help people understand the convergence of learning, technology, and business through fun, laughter, and insight. He's worked for 27 years as a professor of instructional technology and 15 years as the director of the Institute for Interactive Technologies at Bloomsburg University in US. Currently, he's a professor at Commonwealth University of Pennsylvania. He's a founder of L&D Mentor Academy, an award-winning author of many books on digital learning and gamification. He's a TEDx speaker and a LinkedIn learning instructor, as well as a global consultant on gamification, interactive learning, and e-learning. That doesn't even begin to really describe the kind of work he does and the contribution to the whole field of learning design and gamification. But I'll just stop there. Karl, we're so happy to have you here with us. Is there anything you'd like to say before we begin our conversation?
No, I mean, it's fantastic to be here. Thank you for having me. Such a wonderful group and such a, as I said before, such a diverse community, which I really think is exciting to bring those different perspectives and ideas into one place and then be able to discuss those. And so, yeah, I think it's a wonderful thing that you're doing here.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. That means a lot, Karl. So let's start with the big picture, right? And talking about just learning trends across sectors. So as a professor and a leading voice in the L&D space, you have a unique cross-sectoral vantage point. Could you share your insights on the key trends in, technology that are currently shaping and changing learning in both L&D and the education space?
Yes. So, I mean, the number one, of course, is AI. Artificial intelligence, you look at Claude, for example, and you can actually type in games and it, create me a Frogger game and it will create a Frogger game. So I think it's going to make it much more democratic. Right now, to develop a video game is still a ton of work and a lot of effort, and so it's not done as much as maybe we as educators. I know as a professor, I'm like, oh, I'd like to have a really quick game, interaction on this, and I'm like, yeah, well, you're gonna have to get a Unity developer. You're gonna have them like, okay. So I've used a lot of card. So the other interesting trend that I'm seeing, with the video games is the use of card games and board games. So while we are going for a lot of tech, and rightfully so, I think because of the pandemic and if we're in the classroom, how do we engage the people that are right in front of us? And it's not just I'm working with a large $200 billion company, software company. I can't say the name of them, but they have 3 letters in their name and it begins with an S and ends in a P. But they actually are using card games to help their learning professionals engage and interact. And so I think that's really kind of an interesting trend as well. And then in L&D in general, I think we're seeing, and in education in the United States, we're going through a metamorphosis, if you will, where our age of college age students is dropping dramatically. So colleges now are competing more and more for college age students. And one of the competitions is one of the ways that organizations are competing, educational, is to make the education more hands-on, more practical, more partnering with industry. And industry is now partnering more with education. So I think that's a big trend as well. And then another really interesting trend, which I think is kind of cool, is I could go. I lecture for like 3 hours every, for my classes. So you'll have to cut me off if I start monologuing. Um, if you've ever watched The Incredibles, and they always talk about the villains monologuing, and that's when they always get in trouble. So don't let me monologue too much. But uh, the third, another trend is this thing called omni-channel learning, which I think is really interesting. So if you think about omni-channel marketing, that's the idea that I have one experience with a company. So for example, if I go to their website on my app, they know that I've been to their website. If I go into the store, they know I've been on their app. They know what I've been looking for. And so maybe somebody greets me, hey, Dr. Kapp, how are you? Glad you're here today. I know you've been looking at some uh, accessories for your fireplace online. Here, let us show you what we have. So it's all seamless, one experience. But think about learning in a corporation. Often we have, our e-learning modules here. Micro-learning looks a little bit different. Coaching knows nothing about what courses you've taken. Leadership development looks nothing like compliance training. So it's all this disparate experience. Same thing if you go into a college, right? If I go to the economics class, the economics professor has no idea that I'm taking accounting or world history or anything like that. There's not this unity. And omni-channel, it's very nascent right now, but the omni-channel idea is that how can we let this one learner have this experience that knows about the other experiences of the learner, so that you can have a more comprehensive, more personalized, and it feels more like they're talking to me. So look for marketing. I think that's a lot of where this inspiration is coming from for omni-channel, and look for that to become more and more of a trend.
Mm. That's really interesting, Carl. And I believe AI would have a role in that. But, that concept would apply as much to a university as it would to a professional learning, adult learning context. That's really interesting. Also, I think, sometimes we get so stuck in our sectoral knowledge and trends, we don't quite get to know what's happening in other sectors in learning. So it's also interesting to learn that from you. Let's talk about gamification, right?
Mhm.
So, in your book, Gamification of Learning and Instruction, you've written about game based learning, which is often confused with gamification. So, while some participants I know might be familiar with the difference between these two, could you briefly tell us the key difference for those of us who don't know that? At the same time, also, other misconceptions that there are vis-a-vis gamification, and I know you talk about that quite a lot in your books, but just if you could tell us what are the other misconceptions as well?
Yes. So I think there's several ways to look at games versus gamification. And sometimes I like to think of a continuum. So at one end of the continuum are points. You answer a question, you get a point. The other end of the continuum is like a fully immersive Call of Duty type of learning game. And gamification really is in the middle. The mistake I think a lot of people make about gamification is it's about the elements of games, not turning something into a game. So example I often give is LinkedIn Learning, for example. LinkedIn, when it first started, um, didn't have progress bars, and everybody wasn't filling out their profile. But it's really important to fill out your profile in LinkedIn. So what they did was they added a progress bar. They got 30% more people completing their profiles than without the progress bar. I would say that's gamification. And you would say, well, that looks nothing like a game. That doesn't have any elements of a game. There's no creatures or there's no story. There's just that progress bar. But progress is a fundamental element of games, right? You move from level 1 to level 2 to level 3. So adding elements of games into an experience. So for example, I teach a capstone course in my program, and in that course I divide students into teams. I give them a request for proposal, and I have them prepare a sales presentation for a group of corporate professionals. So it's not really a game that I'm playing in class, but I've gamified it because now your group of people are collaborating but also competing against another group for a proposal, just like you would in the actual environment. So those are elements of gamification. A game I always talk about it as a self-contained, typically a one experience, one sit-down experience, and it has a lot of elements. It has points, it has badges, it has sometimes leaderboard, it has stories, it has lots of elements, but it's a self-contained unit. Inside that magic space, you can do things and you're allowed to do things. Outside of that space, you can't. In gamification, I can add to whatever I want points. I could add a leaderboard then, but I am not turning that whole thing into a game. But I want designers to think about engagement. So when you think about the elements of games that we talked about that engage you, like challenge, are you putting challenge in your learning? And it doesn't have to be really elaborate like a game. You don't have to get points for the challenge, but you could say you are a compliance officer and you just notice 3 people are violating this rule. What do? Like start training that way. Start a classroom that way. What we tend to do is we like to start with learning objectives. Sometimes I call them learning objections, right? So a salesperson comes to a sales class and goes, today, you will learn 3 ways to close a sale. And a good salesperson goes, puh, I know 5 ways. What a waste of my time, right? So that's the end of that. You've kind of lost that learner. But what if we just change that a little bit and said, would you like to know the number 1 way sales are closed in our organization? Yeah, maybe I'm doing that. Maybe I'm not, right? So now you've got my attention and you've challenged me like, do you know the number 1 way? Well, I think I do. I'm not sure. So just that simple act of adding challenge doesn't turn your whole course into a game. You don't have to do points and you don't have to do bad, but that one element of challenge or the element of excuse me, the element of collaboration, like I talked about before. Like, can you have somebody collaborate with somebody else? And how do you do that to reach this goal? So there's lots of different ways we can take elements of games, just one element. And I suggest people are like, oh, gamification seems like a huge thing to start or to do. I'm like, no. Just take one piece of it and do it that way. And then that might be a good way to think about it or a good way to approach uh, converting some of your content into gamification.
Right. That's really, really powerful, Karl. Also, you're talking about starting with a challenge. I think in the education sector, we often call it problem-based learning.
Mm-hmm.
So you start with a problem instead of learning objections, as you said. And what also came out for me was even in the way you articulate what is to be learned, right? The top 1 way in which to close sales. So it's also the way one communicates about what the learner can get out of a learning experience. Are there
Right. I
any
mean,
other?
just real quick, for the instructional designers, learning objectives are important for the design, but they're not
Mhm.
necessarily. I mean, there's been studies showing that learners don't pay attention to anything except the main. Like you will be able to. They don't. Nobody reads that, right? It's the part of that you're going to do, and that's kind of like an advanced organizer. If we think of Ozabel's advanced organizers, so we do want to give a little bit of what's coming up, but we want to make it more intriguing and interesting and engaging. Yeah.
Definitely. Are there any other misconceptions, Carl, that you hear a lot and you're like, I want to, this needs to
Yeah.
be clarified
So
right
the
now?
right. So the one misconception I think that's out a lot of gamification is to gamify the very end item. So what do I mean by that? Let's take sales, for example. People say, we're going to give a prize or have a contest for who sells the most, or I'm going to give a prize for whoever gets the highest score in my class or whatever, right? The problem with that is the people who benefit from that are the people that already know how to sell. They already know how to be a good student. They do that. They're going to win. But if you take an average performer, they don't know how to be the good sales person. So they're like struggling with that. How do you do that, right? So the idea is that you take a behavior, like maybe it's making cold calls, and you go, hey, our number 1 salespeople, they make cold calls. So let's gamify making cold calls. Or in class, hey, my best students write essays that are over 2 pages long and contain this, this, and this. So let's gamify that. So rather than gamify kind of the end goal, gamifying the behaviors that lead to that goal raises the ship for everybody, or raises the tide for everybody. If we just gamify kind of the end objective, the people that already know how to do it are the only ones who are going to benefit. And that's a real problem I see in gamification, is when people don't look at the behaviors and they decide to gamify things that are not that are already achievable and that aren't going to help you reach your goal. Like if you say whoever sells the most wins, like you're not helping me sell the most, right? Whoever makes the most cold calls, whoever demos the most product, whoever writes the tightest essay, whoever studies 3 days a week, those are the things that make the difference, not the end goal.
Wow, that was really insightful. That was and let's dig a little bit more into what the nuances of gamification are, right? Karl, I think you talked distinctly about two types of gamification. So there is structural gamification and there's content gamification. Could you explain what these two approaches are and which one might be more useful?
Yes, and I'll even throw in a third approach just for fun. The idea behind content gamification is where you change content itself to be more game-like. So that's where we go ahead and we change learning objective into a question. That's where we start the course with a challenge instead of wall of text, wall of text, wall of text. That's where we involve the students right away in the process. That's content gamification. Like a good example of this, I was called in one time. There's this company, they were having some fraud issues. So they were teaching people how to do investigations. It was Department of Defense. And they had me come in and look at their course. And it was a beautifully designed course by a bunch of lawyers, right? Introduction, terminology, forms, and then at the end there was a little case study, and we flipped that on its head. We started with the case study. So as soon as you came into class, the thing on the board was, your boss has just been accused of embezzling $10 million. What do you do? Right? And so for the first 10 minutes, everybody's like, what do we do? And then somebody's like, well, there's a web page on embezzlement on our ethics. Okay, let's go there, and that started the whole process. So that's content gamification. The other idea is that structural gamification takes your content and adds points, badges, levels, things around the content.
Sorry, Karl, I think you got muted.
And that's the secret to life.
We missed the structural gamification part. Sorry.
Yeah, no, just kidding. So structural gamification is where you add points, badges, and leaderboards around the content itself, but you don't change the content. A really good example of this, a lot of people say to me, "Hey, Dr. Kapp, I don't want to gamify school. Like school is probably the most gamified element ever, right? You get points for spelling a word correctly. What is that? That's points, right? You have class ranking. What is that? That's a leaderboard. You've got different grade levels. What is that? That's levels, right? So school is probably the most gamified experience anyone will ever have. That's not, specifically gamified, but it's gamified. So within that context, we can do things that are structurally gamified and structurally done well. So that's the structural gamification. And the third gamification is performance-based gamification. What that is that's where you get feedback directly on what you're doing on the job. So let's say you're at a call center and you answer a call and you resolve it in a minute. You get so many points for resolving in a minute. Another one, the customer calls back, so you lose points because the customer's not supposed to call back, right? So that's your job being gamified itself. Now there's some issues with that. Amazon got in a lot of trouble because they gamified some of their warehouse picking and packing, and they were accused of overworking their employees because they were trying to accomplish the items in the game. So So gamification is not, a panacea that solves all problems and makes the world a greater place. It's a tool, and it has to be done strategically and tactically, just like other tools, right? You shouldn't. I tell people, you shouldn't lecture all the time. You should have activities and engagement. You shouldn't gamify all the time. You should have activities and engagement, right? Problem-based learning isn't the answer to every type of learning. Like, you don't want to learn vocabulary with problem-based learning. But same thing with games, right? So Jeopardy is not a game to teach problem solving, right? Jeopardy is a memorization game. So don't try to teach problem solving with Jeopardy, right? Make sure you use the right game design or gamification design for the right type of content. And that's an issue too that I think is important to consider.
Wow. First of all, this is the first time I saw school and gamification, like how you can look at school system and say, oh, that's gamification. I never really thought about school as an example of bad structural gamification. So thanks for sharing that. But you've already, I think, started us off on this whole field of gamification gone wrong, like wrong applications of gamification, or just poor applications essentially. But so let's dive a little deeper into that. Can you tell us more about how gamification can sort of derail learning, and so when not to use gamification as well?
Right. So a couple really interesting things. One is the research shows that the bigger the prize, the less learning. So if you have a prize like, oh, you're going to go to Hawaii if you learn this, this, and this, people now only focus on going to Hawaii. And now people are very clever at working around systems and working around gamified systems. So people will gamify because the prize is so big. So you want to make sure that your reward is not disproportionate. The other thing that you want to make sure is that, like, let's say I've seen this a number of times, point systems. The point systems are disproportionate to the value of the activity. So for example, logging in is not worth 10 million points. I mean, you got to log in. That's what you do every day. Don't make logging in 10 million points, right? Make it a few points, maybe, if you have to. But maybe sales strategy or learning about the history of India or something like that, that should be worth more points. So don't think about proportionately distributing the points if you're going to use points. The other thing is, and we talked about this at the beginning, think about collaboration. Can you incentivize people to collaborate and work together? And look to games that encourage collaboration and then add that into your repertoire of gamification. Collaboration is so underrated yet so necessary. And as people become more digitally isolated, the need to collaborate becomes even greater. So using tools and incentives to help people collaborate is a really important gamification mistake to miss, to make sure that you don't make. The other gamification mistake that I see some organizations make is that the computer system or whatever they're doing is gamified, but like nobody else talks about it. So if gamification is over here in a corner and nobody else talks about, like, hey, Karl, you did a really good job today. I saw that you earned 300 points by resolving these calls. Can you tell us how you did that and share so that we can, like that kind of sharing and helping other people understand that is very important. If you don't do that, then people are going to quickly learn, well, nobody really cares about the points. Nobody cares about these things, so I'm not going to do them. I think, and then the last thing I think is, of the two gamifications, structural gamification or content gamification, those three, I guess, performance, but I think content gamification is the most powerful. So think about your content that you're developing. How can you make it, and maybe even gamification is not the right word. Maybe the right word is engaging, activity-based learning. I think, and so it's so, I don't know. It's so fascinating to me how we think about education. So we used to do education in class in a very small classroom, and it used to be very kind of one-on-one. Before that, we had journeymen teaching apprentices, a very one-on-one, probably the best way to teach somebody anything, right? That's the great. The next item that we did was we mass produced education, and mass education doesn't work. And then computers came out. What a great opportunity for personalization. But we mass produced education. We didn't personalize it. We now have the tools, I think, through AI and through gamification, that we can actually think about personalized, engaging instruction. And that's something that I'm very excited about. Uh, I have a video on how to create a chatbot. So if you haven't created a chatbot in any of the tools, you need to do that. I happen to do it in ChatGPT, and I gave her a personality. Like I said, I want you to be like Robin Williams and Ellen DeGeneres and Stephen Wright. And I spent hours asking her questions about topics and things like that. She's not always 100% correct, but 9 times out of 10, it's really interesting. And a few more times it's been really insightful. I'm like, oh, I never thought of it that way before. Wow. So I think that we have that to really help us as designers of instruction make learning specific for the students, whether they're corporate or academic, and do that through content gamification.
Wow, there was so much in it, Karl. I think your constant emphasis on one, collaboration-based games instead of just thinking of competition as games, also reminded me of, this whole focus in the education space as well on integrating social and emotional learning into the mainstream education curriculum. And this sounds like such a great way of doing that.
Thank you, Bob.
You could be talking about teaching certain content and embedding certain aspired behaviors, but in the workspace context as well as in education. So how you design gamification can actually cultivate certain behaviors, and collaboration being one sounds very
exactly. I often talk about a leaderboard, right? The first person on a leaderboard is super excited. The 10th person is kind of excited. The 100th person is demotivated, right? So leaderboards are not the way to go if we really want to accelerate everybody. And that's why you have the valedictorian and everybody in class, and you have the people that in 3rd grade came in 100 and at 3rd grade decided, I'm done. I can't compete with those people. I'm done. And it's really a waste of human potential when we do things like that.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask maybe, I'm just looking at the time, and I'm so sad we have just about an hour, but one really application-based questions, Karl, that many of us would like to know is, for any one of us who's, looking to gamify existing training or course, could you give us some guidance on the steps and strategies that one can go about doing that?
I think I think we have to think about, I think Mark highlighted it, right? So we have to think about, a lot of times we think about what do we want the person to learn or to know. I think we need to think about what do we want the person to do. And even on academia, so do we want the person to be a good citizen? Well, what does that mean? What behavior is a good citizen? So I would say voting, right? So you vote, that's the behavior of a good citizen. You respect others, that's the behavior of a good citizen. So what we need to do is we need to find out what behavior we want the person to do, and then work backwards from that behavior. So once we have that behavior, why is that person not doing that behavior, and how can we help them do that behavior? So maybe one is knowledge. They're not doing that behavior because they don't have the knowledge. One might be practice. And gamification is great for practice because games are good for repetitive activities, but that they don't seem like a repetitive activity, right? So, there's a game like Math Blaster, and these math problems come at you. And it's fun to kind of solve the math problems. But boy, if I gave you a thick stack of worksheets and said, do these math problems, you'd be like, yeah, I'm not doing that, right? So that is the difference between like kind of a game environment and also the worksheet environment. So take the behavior, break the behavior into its component parts, maybe it's knowledge, maybe it's behavior, and give the learners either the knowledge to do that or the practice to do that. Also, think about an easy way is think about taking the content that you're teaching and wrap it in a story. So what does the person because if you're teaching in corporate, there's a story behind like why you need to do this, right? There's a story behind that. There's case studies. If you're in academia, there's stories of like, well, why do I need to learn about these chemicals? Well, because these chemicals are used here, here, and here, could be harmful here, here. In fact, here's a story of somebody, right? Uh, so you could do those stories. History is replete with stories. Economics, like pick the stories that do that. And then the third thing is when you pick this story, put the learner in charge of making decisions of consequence. Maybe it's a branching. I have a course on YouTube on branching simulations, but making a learner make a choice is good. It forces them to think, and maybe it's the right choice, maybe it's the wrong choice. That's okay. But having them make that choice has them committing. So rather than sitting back and listening to a lecture, making choices throughout the lecture works really well. And one technique that is really good for learning that people kind of poo-poo is the idea of quizzing. Quizzes are great tools for learning. They force you to recall knowledge. The actual recalling of knowledge is not just a recall, but it's actually a learning process itself. So putting learners in situations, gamifying where they have to apply a behavior, where they have to recall knowledge, whether it's a quiz or an interactivity or a gamified experience. A lot of times games can be proxies for quizzes. You can make a card game or a board game where people are answering questions. Be clever about that. The last thing I'll say about that, because as I said, I could talk forever, is play lots of different kind of games. Play games you don't like, play games you do like, play video games, play board analog games, and you'll start to pick up what I call game literacy, which is things that games do. Like if you play Pandemic, it has action cards. Oh, so does Catan. Oh, so does lots of games have action cards. What do? Well, they tell you what you're allowed or not allowed to do on a turn. Oh, okay, let's incorporate that into a learning process, right? So once you get these literacy pieces of literacy from games, they'll naturally work their way into your instruction.
Awesome. Those are great tips and really practical tips, Karl. There's so many questions coming up on chat, but I'm going to ask one more. And this is about your book that's coming up in April called Action First Learning. If you could tell us a little bit about that, and also any place, website, channels that we could all use to learn more about how to do
Yes.
it well.
Okay, yeah. I'm super excited about my book that's coming up. It's called Action First Learning. And I was originally going to call it, actually, my publisher told me not to talk about it because she's like, oh, it's not coming out till April, so people forget about it by April. So I'm hoping that the publisher's wrong, but basically it's called Action First Learning, and it's about instructional design techniques to engage and inspire. And so basically there's a chapter on action-based learning, but then it talks about things like how do you create a card game? How do you create a board game? Every chapter starts with an action, something you have to do. So in the card game chapter, you got to get a deck of cards and you got to do certain things. And every chapter ends with an AI prompt, maybe to help you make a card game or help you make a board game. So, and we have a whole chapter in there on accessibility as well. So, how do you make these things accessible? So we've done a lot of different things. And my colleague, Kevin Thorne, at the beginning of every chapter has created a really cool image. So he's drawn images for every chapter. We're thinking about maybe even making that into like an adult coloring book where you could kind of do something like that. But that's coming out in April, so look for that. I'm very excited about that. It's been a number of years since I've written a book, and I was going to call it Beyond Gamification, and I thought, well, but basically it's taking the next step to action first learning. And the idea is that just like we started this webinar, every single instructional event that you do needs to start with action. Stop starting with content, start with action and behavior. So that's the idea. Then I also have, if you haven't already, I have a LinkedIn, what do I call a newsletter called L&D Easter eggs. So just follow me on LinkedIn, and I'm always semi always posting. So I'm occasionally posting on my LinkedIn newsletter. Been doing a lot on AI lately. I've been working with Colossian and kind of doing some things on there, which has been kind of cool. And then my YouTube channel, I have a really cool series that I'm very excited about called The Unofficial Unauthorized History of Learning Games, or the unofficial unauthorized, sometimes I do it both ways. But the idea behind that is I look at games like the MIT beer distribution game, I look at war games, I actually talked to Tiagi, who, is like the grandfather of all games for learning, and try to apply those then to what we can do now. And that's been a really fun series to do as well. So I would recommend follow me on LinkedIn, grab the newsletter. I post to resources there, and then my YouTube channel is probably a great way to go. I have a website, but it's a little old, unlike the Shoemaker's Kids. But those are some things. And then look for the book. I'm going to add a lot more videos too for the Action First Learning book. But I'm very excited about that.
We're so excited about this, Karl. I just, dived into some of your books and even just the way they are written. It's so different from the other books that you read. It's like, how can a book be gamified? I think, it's something to learn from. Just amazing. I'm just going to
Oh, thank
pass
you.
off very quickly to Miriam. There are a bunch of questions coming up on chat. So, Miriam, over to you. Let's take participants' questions.
Thank you so much for this. It's been so insightful to listen to everything you have to say. I'm really excited about the book. And I feel like in the last 2-3 minutes, you've given at least me, and I'm sure I speak for everyone, so many resources to dive deep into over the upcoming weekend. And go on.
Fantastic. No, the number one resource is go to your kid's game closet, grab a game and start playing. That's what you need to do.
I totally agree. I can't wait to do that. I'll grab some friends and get playing Catan this weekend. And then I'll tell them I'm doing this for work.
That's right.
Yeah. So we have a question from Wendy. She's asking, what are your thoughts on how learning professional, her specifically being an instructional designer, can best keep up with trends and make it a meaningful part of their professional development?
Yeah, Wendy, that's a great question. And hello, Wendy. Good to virtually see you again. So I think one of the things that learning and development professionals need to do is, belong to professional groups like this, or like ATD or like the Guild, where people are sharing kind of what they're doing and they're bringing in people talking about what's happening in the field. I think that's important. I think that can be very helpful. I think the other thing to do is I get a lot of cues from the commercial world, right? So what's happening in the commercial world? Well, omni-channel marketing has been around way before omni-channel learning. Okay, so they're doing this kind of revolutionary thing there. Like, what's that mean from a learning perspective? And sometimes it doesn't mean anything. Like, when the Apple Watch came out, everybody's like, oh, watch-based learning. I'm like, what? Like, why? So it has to be a reason for something to happen. It has to make sense. So we have to be smart and critical about it. But I think looking at commercial things and then looking at somebody the other day just posted a bunch of folks on LinkedIn to follow, follow those folks, see what's happening. But I think learning communities are probably one of the most powerful ways to think about upping your game and then looking out what's happening. You could join, of course, ATD has a group, like the Guild has a group. This is a great group to join. So that would be my first step.
Thank you. I totally agree. I'm going to sound biased, but I personally think this is a great group to join too. So I'm putting the links to the LBC community and our different channels in the chat box again. But I mean, I agree, and I'm not trying to derail the conversation, but I do feel like that since joining the LDC, my understanding of different areas related to learning design in so many different fields has really expanded, and it really helps me personally. The next question is from Vishwa, who works for an education company and is asking how game-based learning could differ for different ages, and if there is a specific framework or some frameworks that you recommend.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I think, so I want to step back and I say, I think it needs to differ based on what you're teaching. So are you teaching memorization? Are you teaching critical thinking? Are you teaching math skills? So I think there's a little difference in what you're actually teaching in the approaches that you use. So for example, if you're teaching vocabulary, you're using matching, you're integrating it into sentences. You're doing things that way. If you're teaching math, it depends on what method you use, right? You could use the rote memorization math, you could use estimation math, but depending on how you're doing that. So once you've matched the right context to the right game, the content to the right game design, then I think definitely there's different ages. I've seen things in terms of the look and feel of the game. I've seen things different from the activities of the learner, what type of feedback you give. All of that can be age dependent. The one thing I'll say, if you're doing a game in the United States, it's really hard to get a game into a school, really hard. So a lot of people do it outside of school. And if you want to attract the kids, the learners, not necessarily the parents, aim for a look and feel that's above their age group. Like in the United States, we have a magazine called 17. No 17-year-old in the right mind reads 17. It's 15-year-olds, it's 14-year-olds, because they want to, like, what does a 17-year-old do? Wow, I want to know, right? So the idea is you aim up for the audience, and that will be more attractive to the audience than if you now obviously you have to do that with some balance. You can't be PhD versus information versus for a 2-year-old, but you do need to maybe a 4-year-old, because look at how kids look up to their older siblings. Your second child will speak a lot faster than your first child because they're trying to imitate their sister or brother or whomever, right? So that tends to happen. They'll walk faster because they've got a model that's not that far away. So you just kind of want to be that one level above and kind of let them go up there. I worked with a financial app for teenagers, actually in Saudi Arabia. And one of the interesting things we did there was we added a parent side to it, mostly because it was financial. But you could think about, can the parent give you kudos? Can the parent, help you with their advice, give their stories, give their ideas? So that's another way that you could think about that as well.
Thank you. So insightful. I can't wait to re-listen to the recording of this and take all of this in, because everything you're saying is just so helpful and insightful. Vishwa has another question, but just to be fair and mindful of time, I'll go on to someone else's question. And we have Ragini, who's asking if you could share examples of systems and games that provide an alternative to the leaderboard or the typical ranking system. Specifically, so learners can understand their relation to their peers in a non-toxic competitive way.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I guess my question would be, is it in a group setting? So one of the things that is often done is group-based success. So for example, rather than individually awarding a person, award a group. Oh, so this group, earned 10 points, or this group earned 10 points, rather than providing points in there. You could also do winning through overcoming a challenge. So rather than giving points, you could say, here's a challenge. Every group that overcomes that challenge is deemed successful. So that way you don't have a winner. I mean, anytime you have a winner, you automatically have a loser. And some people take losing well and some people don't. I did a workshop one time. We were just doing a warm-up game. This woman lost and she checked out for the rest of the workshop because she had lost that game. I'm like, okay, that was like not even the point of the workshop. So if you make it challenge-based and the group overcomes a challenge and all challengers are successful, that can be a way of not using points and not using peer-to-peer comparisons to help everybody achieve success. And you could also, the other thing I've seen done is a group that is the first one across the finish line or competes the challenge gets kudos and compliments for helping the other groups get across that challenge. right? You can say, if you get across the challenge, what I want you to do is help the other groups. Don't give them the answer, but coach them to getting across the challenge where they're having troubles. And intrinsically, that's a really feel-good experience for the learners.
Thank you. I have two questions about incorporating game-based learning with adults. One is for SMEs, encouraging them to incorporate SMEs, encouraging SMEs to incorporate game-based learning into their content, and also about including game-based learning for teacher trainings, especially in the reason I'm combining this is because of time, but also both cases are adults who might be resistant to game-based learning in their content or their workshops. So what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things about games, if we think about them, is they're abstractions of reality. So for example, the game Catan is an abstraction of gathering resources like you would have to do and building roads. Monopoly is an abstraction of buying property and renting property. So think of teacher training or therapy or whatever, abstract that a level up. So can you, for example, go over classroom discipline as something that you would need to do, a behavior, but turn that into a game? How many discipline problems can you spot? How many discipline problems can you nip in the bud by doing X, Y, or Z? How many situations can you defuse by doing this? So now you make a game or the activity defusing the situation. So here's the situation. Maybe I put it on a playing card and I have diffuse cards and I have different cards that I can diffuse that situation. That might be a way that I can do that. Or I might have somebody who has a counseling issue. I may have certain counseling cards. Maybe I can play those counseling cards. So those are ways. So think about what you want, the ultimate behavior you want, and think about how can you abstract that behavior to an activity that reinforces the concept, but doesn't seem like it's a game. And again, gamification doesn't have to seem like a game. Adults are very comfortable with cards, and so cards seem mature, and so you could put mature instructions or something on those cards, and adults will be like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Okay, that's good.
Awesome, thank you. I noticed Esteban had his hand up and he was asking a similar question about the advantages of gamification for also adults. So I'm hoping that's answering along the same lines of that question.
Yeah, two things with that. One is it doesn't
Hmm.
have to look like don't make it look like a game. Like when LinkedIn did the progress bar, it didn't look like a game, right? So think of elements you can take to make the instruction more engaging and more beneficial, but don't necessarily have to look like a game.
That makes sense. Our next question is from Neha, who is asking if things like a quiz in the middle of a gamified experience, would something like that lead to disengagement?
It depends on how you craft the quiz, right? So if you say, stop, okay, everybody take a break, now take the quiz, that definitely would do it, right? But what if you had a reporter who asked, wow, you just had a really fascinating experience. Can you answer a couple questions for me? Right? So if it's embedded in the story and the process, then the multiple choice question doesn't look like a multiple choice test. But if you stop everything, take the multiple choice test, then it looks like a multiple. So the idea is to integrate that into the process. Maybe a character asks the question. Maybe you have to take a note in your journal. Maybe you need to answer before we continue, we need to make sure we know this. So let's answer these 3 questions. Oh, okay, and go on from there. So that's a way to think about that.
Awesome. We have Shabazz who works on making game-based learning tools or activities, and a lot of them are physical and in person and focus on behavior. So there's a question around creating activity-based learning focused around behavior. Do you have any examples to help with that?
I think, yes. Hold on one second. So The idea, again, any kind of behavior is to break down, start with the behavior and then do a task analysis, right? Or behavioral analysis, right? What behavior do I want them to do? I want them to greet a customer with a smile when they walk into the office. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, first they have to be able to recognize a customer. First, they have to be able to know how to smile. First, they have to then they have to intellectually think, okay, I need to smile. Like, so you can break that down. So maybe you have an exercise like, let's just do a smiling exercise. Okay, everybody, 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, I'm going to give you a card. It's going to say smile or frown. I want you to smile or frown, right? So you can kind of work on the broken down, that's maybe a silly example, but you need to work on the broken down behaviors and then reinforce those behaviors that you want them to do through the activities or things like that. I think hands-on activities are wonderful. And so I think you already have the tools and the skill set there. What you just need to do is, and you're probably doing this already, is just break down the skill and have them practice those skills and then put those together. Now, there's another concept called interleaving, which I think it makes sense to mention here. Interleaving is the idea. So one of the things that we like to do when we teach skills or behaviors is we'll teach one behavior, one behavior, one behavior, one behavior, and then we'll teach another behavior, and then we'll say, okay, now put them all together. But actually what we should do is teach one behavior, then another behavior, then another, then another, and another, and we should intermix them. So if you're teaching somebody tennis, for example, don't spend an hour and a half on forehand and an hour and a half on backhand. Do 5 minutes of forehand, 5 minutes of backhand. Now do a game where you're doing forehand and backhand, because that's how you're really going to use your forehand and your backhand. You're not going to hit 100 shots in a row backhand. So interleaving. So let's do that for a sales example. For example, teaching the sales model, then teach about the client, then teach our product. No, teach it together. Teach the product, the model, and together. Same thing with, it's a little harder in academia because we divide, here's an economic class, here's an accounting class, here's a philosophy class, and so what happens sometimes to my students sometimes, if I'm not careful, is they lose track of like, well, okay, I'm learning about economics, but like in a vacuum, like what does it mean from sociology perspective, right? Bring in those different perspectives so that they can see the gestalt, the big picture, rather than the narrow myopic image. And for being in academia, sometimes for me, like the myopic part of it is fun because like I get to drill down, but really a student wants to know how this is connected. A worker wants to know how this is connected. So if we connect the dots, we're in a much better shape than if we leave the dots, drill down really deep, but don't discuss it. I mean, there is need for that, definitely, but we have to balance it. And I think the balance is in the other way sometimes.
It's really interesting, Karl. Some of these things also came up when and Nidhi had joined us today. I'm not sure if she's still here, but Nidhi Sachdeva from University of Toronto actually was talking about some of the cognitive science insights on this, and did talk about some of these principles for learning design as well. So there's so many more questions and comments on the screen, but I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the time. We're already 2 minutes past our closing time. We won't be able to take all the questions today. I do invite you to stay back if you like to discuss some of these with peers. So I'm not sure if Karl would be able to stay back with us, but you're welcome to discuss some of these questions with other practitioners who are with us in the webinar.
Actually, I'm going to have to go, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's fine. So thanks a lot, Karl,
Thanks for having me.
joining us today. And before you leave, I just want to announce that we would be reading Karl's book called, just a second, it's called Gamification of Learning and Instruction. And we would be reading that and meeting next Wednesday to discuss how it applies to our practice and our interpretation of our experiences vis-a-vis applying some of those principles in the book. So you're welcome to join the meetup next Wednesday. And next month, we would be having a similar conversation with Dr. Philippa Hardman. Many of you might know her. She's one of the leaders driving AI adoption in learning, in the workspace learning in universities as well. So Dr. Hardman would be joining us in January next month. So look up for our events on our events page, and we hope to see you again. But thanks a bunch, Karl. This was so insightful. I
Thanks.
think we're just going to watch this over and over, make notes, and ensure that we apply at least 10-20% of what we learned today from you in our practice. It's been
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Yeah.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
everyone. Thank you, Karl.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. And for those of you who want to join, stay back to just get to know other people interested in games, gamification, game thinking for learning, you can stay back and we'll start our networking session in about 2 minutes.